So, welcome back. This is a really exciting interview for me, and I'm really delighted that Sally Wood has agreed to come and speak to me because she has got a huge amount of experience in the NHS. In fact, 26 years as a specialist OT in neuro rehab, Sally. So you're as much of an old timer, pretty much, as me, and I've been around the NHS for a long time, and I've seen many changes. So you're very welcome. I'm glad to speak to you.
Thank you very much. And I see that clinical experience as a real strength now because I do see this dissonance between management and non-clinical staff and policy, and those of us who are working directly with patients who see the effect and impact of policy. And safeguarding is in our DNA. And so when those things don't match up, our involvement is not sought. So there is a very big divide now between the policy that affects our patients and us who care for them, who can see what their needs are.
Essentially, obviously, people are being frightened to speak, and we all know why that is. But there's back in the day when I trained, one of the biggest things that was drilled into me and that we worked tirelessly for, and obviously when I was lecturing, I also taught nurses was about the privacy, dignity, and security of patients. And it was essentially at the heart of everything that we did. Because they were considered to be vulnerable in many different ways. And the NHS was there not only to try and provide them with various care needs, but also to act on their behalf. And I know that this is one of your areas of speciality. So maybe start me off with giving me a tiny bit of background that you're comfortable with, that sort of brought you to this point where you're doing this huge amount of work within this sort of gender area.
I have come from a place of, as I say, my interest is in the hands-on care of patients and the day-to-day work with them and accompanying them on this journey through this very difficult time in their life, where the outcome is very uncertain and their path to it is very precarious. So that makes our job very important and very rewarding. And it also means that safeguarding is present really in every moment of our clinical work and our awareness. So it's risk assessment all the way along.
So you got alerted to the fact that there was a bit of an issue going on, probably because, did you come into it from the sort of gender wars, or because that you saw some problems with the impact of policy within your trust? Or
no, actually, it was the first. So
right.
I was following the discourse on Twitter about trans ideology. It was a departure from reality. So I then realized that there was a conflict between the rights of people who express a rejection of their sex and the rights of women. But it wasn't until I heard the speech by Baroness Nicholson last March in the House of Lords via Twitter that I learned about the existence of an appendix to our safeguarding policy. And this marvelous safeguarding policy is very robust and very successful. And it's called Delivering Same-Sex Accommodation.
Right. Which was Andrew Lansley.
Andrew Lansley presided over that.
In 2010, that came about.
Yes.
And the background to that was because we knew that, that women especially were vulnerable and fared better if they were put into single-sex environments.
Yes, and we came to that understanding over decades of trying different things. So institutional care for patients has evolved, and we've come from strict sex segregation, where other practices might have been rather less humane and rather less individualized as well. There was then a push, or then a feeling that we ought to be providing more humane environments and allowing mixing because there's a great thing to benefit to that, of course. And then it became clear that women were at risk of exploitation sexually,
Right.
or through violence, physical violence. So that was obviously something that was noted and observed over decades.
Yeah.
So it was clear through the end of the last century, 80s and 90s, there was a growing awareness that this situation was very poor at safeguarding, that there were preventable problems attendant on mixing sexes. And there was a great desire, actually, for the privacy and dignity that sex segregation afforded both men and women, which culminated in delivering same-sex accommodation in 2010. Now, nobody could have predicted, and not many people knew, that at the end of this wonderful policy, there had been slipped in a little appendix called Annex B. Who could have imagined that this very evidence-based document, who could have expected that we were going to be told that in some situations we could just close that policy, that it was disabled and it didn't count anymore.
And just for clarity, that means that essentially someone can, it's de facto self-ID. So people can basically say that they have a gender identity which is different to their biological sex.
That's right.
And then be accommodated in a different way.
Yes. Annex B was not written for those people alone, and it was written for any person who is whose gender is incongruent with their sex. And this gender could be anything. It could be something that that has only recently been invented or talked about. So, for example, non-binary is somebody who doesn't really feel fixed in either sex. Well, a non-binary person is still either male or female, is a man or a woman, as we all know. And yet, the right to that person is given to choose the accommodation that they wish for. So a man can enter a hospital and he must be asked, where would you be more comfortable being accommodated? And the instruction is comply immediately.
And more than that, there's a number of policies which I've looked for on the internet, and they're freely available, that where they will actively punish any woman, for example, who deigns to question this. And we actually know of cases now where this has come up, where if you say, but that's a man, the staff have been told within these policies essentially to gaslight these patients, tell them that they're wrong, and that the patient will be treated as a hostile, and that they will effectively be punished, and that could go down on your notes, and you could be ejected from the hospital, and it's
Yes.
tantamount to being called a racist. So you will be ultimately be transphobic, and in their eyes that is, so this is a very serious issue that I think that the general public are not aware of, because if you have some effectively a black mark on your hospital notes, this is not something that you wished.
That is a further development, and that shows how far the ideological capture has gone. So the first step was writing a policy that incorporated anybody with any kind of different identity. And I'll read out what I think is the new version of Annex B. So it says, transgender is a broad, inclusive term referring to anyone whose personal experience of gender extends beyond the typical experiences of their assigned sex at birth. It includes those who identify as non-binary. And later on, it says it also includes those who temporarily or continuously occupy a gender role that's not consistent with their sex. So that involves people who cross-dress occasionally. So you could perhaps enjoy dressing up as the opposite sex on the weekend. You would still be covered in this policy. A man who is a man from Monday to Friday can be admitted to hospital as a woman and be given the choice to go into a woman's ward. There are many other genders, as we know, more than 70 genders that have been described. All of those people with those gender identities are either male or female. And
One of the practicalities, and because I'm always like I always feel the need to create a visual on these things. People often say, okay, well, we could just put the curtains around these people. The biggest, most important, powerful tool in any healthcare professional's bag across the board is the power of observation. So if you put curtains around a patient, you obscure other patients, but you also obscure that patient. And if you've got to the point where you're actually in a hospital, it means that you are in need of observation. So this is something that you do not want to happen, to hide behind curtains for your own, privacy and expression of your gender identity, etc.
Absolutely. And in this newly reviewed Annex B, it persists in presenting this as an option that this will make people safe. Well, of course, curtains don't make them safe. They don't give much dignity or privacy either, because a curtain can be whisked back at any moment, but it can also provide privacy to a predator. And that happened in a case in Ireland where a very young woman of 17 was accommodated in a bay with 3 other men, and she was very multiply injured after an accident. She wasn't able to use her call bell, and the curtains were drawn around her. Overnight, the worst happened. So she was sexually abused by one of those men, and she could do nothing about it. And the staff only knew that something had happened when they did his observations and found that his heart rate had gone sky high, and they made some inquiries. So in that instance, those curtains protected the predator, and anybody who works on a ward or who has worked on a ward knows that they are very much a temporary screen for carrying out intimate care. They don't prevent conversations being overheard, of course. Curtains should not come anywhere near this policy because they don't offer safety, privacy, or dignity. Mm-hmm. We have to have a physical environment that segregates people according to sex.
Can you expand a bit more on the information you've got about the sexual assaults and rapes? Because I know that you've done quite a bit of work on freedom of information requests and stuff, haven't you?
That's right. My good friend Teresa Steele decided to make a freedom of information request to my hospital about sexual assaults, and it was refused. So she went to the police force. It was refused the first time, and she appealed, and she gained a reply to it, and it was rather surprising to us because it told us that over the last 3.5 years there had actually been 3 rapes in the hospital, just one hospital, 11 sexual assaults, and no charges. And that pattern we have seen now is consistent across the UK, and the results are particularly terrible from psychiatric units, which you might expect, because one reason is because patients tend to be medically more mobile or in better condition. They might have mental health conditions where they are much more impulsive or be more troubled.
Yeah, and the whole sexual component is often a big feature.
Yes, and it's come to light that many mental health units don't observe the policy delivering same-sex accommodation, and they are offering only mixed accommodation. So in the policy, it says very clearly that in mental health units, not only all the facilities should be segregated as they are in physical medical wards, so your toilet and bathroom facilities have to be accessible to you without you going across and mixing with men, except that there may be a corridor which is mixed, obviously. But in mental health units, it goes further and says that you must have access to a single-sex lounge, a day lounge. So it should be possible for you to be admitted to hospital and never have to deal with men who have mental illness, who might have their own problems with violence and sexual aggression towards women. But that clearly isn't happening at all. And
Yeah, God. I'm just reading a CQC report on mental health units, and I'm absolutely, I mean, there's always been a huge issue with mental health and staffing, and beds, but this is never in my lifetime have I seen such horrific comments regarding the lack of staffing and assaults and the vulnerabilities that I can imagine women are under from violence because of the use of agency staff, and putting patients in segregation rooms just because there's no beds and mixing them up because there's no beds, and it's atrocious, really, and really bad.
Yes, and CQC ran their own project and wrote about it in 2018, where they surveyed all mental health units in England and Wales, and they discovered that there had been over 11,000 incidents of sexual abuse, and they wrote some recommendations on the back of that. So this is a very high prevalence of sexual assault in mental health wards, and I think it is a scandal that not more is being done.
Mm.
In fact, this week there's news of a proposal for a new unit to be built in Boston, in Lincolnshire, which says at the outset that it's a mixed gender ward. Well, that's completely going against the policy, our NHS England policy, and cannot have that conclusion can't have been reached by consultation,
Mm.
because there is so much evidence to show now that mixed sex is very dangerous for women.
Mm.
In fact, another trust, Avon and Wiltshire Trust, have been severely rapped by the CQC recently, and their response has had to be to close their mixed sex accommodation mental health unit, and they are having to build a new one which will be segregated.
Mm.
So the entire unit will be single sex
Mm.
only. So in one part of the country, trusts are having to put in a vast amount of funding now to reverse what they have done and to reverse mixed sex policy. And in another part of the country, they're planning to sink a lot of money into building new mixed sex units.
Mm.
So we're going to have to mount an objection to that.
Yeah.
Um, there's lots of other legislation as well, which means that we cannot work Annex B in our daily work. So one of those is the Health and Care Act 2022, which used to be called the Health and Social Care Act. It was augmented after the Stafford Hospital scandal, where up to 1,500 people died unnecessarily, and there were some standards written which were inserted into this act, and several of those standards are very relevant here. So one of them is the right to person-centered care, and this includes choosing the things that are important to you, so your needs and wishes are respected in that standard. Another one is dignity and respect, which involves privacy. Another one is consent. You can't have anything happen to you that you haven't consented to, unless, of course, you are unable to make that decision legally, and that is a different matter.
Mm.
Another standard is safeguarding from abuse, safety of treatment, and the duty of candour.
Mm.
So all of those standards are very relevant to how we deliver care and what we can expect as a patient. And that's quite a powerful tool. It means that if these standards are not upheld, we then have a case to make a complaint, and we would do that first to the trust, and then if we were fobbed off, we would take it to the CQC, who would have a duty to investigate. The only caveat to that advice is that, of course, we know that the CQC are not immune to ideological capture themselves.
Mm.
We
Mm.
don't know.
I'm really am really concerned about this issue of the patient experience, and how women are being treated, especially this lack of transparency, because I don't believe that the staff on the wards are actually going to be comfortable with doing this. I mean, there's going to be a couple of people who are walking about with this, with their rainbow badges, which was a failed scheme. But the fact is, if you were there struggling, in pain, really vulnerable for a whole multitude of reasons, and you are being gaslit, this is really unacceptable.
It's unbelievable to us, isn't it? And to most people in the United Kingdom, when the concept of privacy and dignity and vulnerability are so easily understood by every single person. In fact, my son started showing his need for privacy from the age of 10. He was starting to, want to be on his own, to take his top off, and he had all the privacy he wanted and needed. But that showed me that it is actually innate. And to override that need is something that is so fundamentally wrong and abusive. And you touched on the shaming of women who might object to a man in their single-sex ward. These women have been admitted to hospital and are, by definition, they are vulnerable. And so to suddenly find that your single-sex ward has a man in it, most people, if they're able, are going to question this and object. And so Glasgow and Clyde NHS and NHS Ayrshire, Arran and Ayrshire,
Right.
in Scotland have adopted their own policy on this to train staff in what they should do with these objecting women. It would be appropriate to reiterate that the ward is indeed female only and that there are no men present. Now that's directly that is unethical, because you are literally telling a lie to somebody who needs to be treated with honesty and care. It means that her needs and wishes are completely crushed to zero. Because if this is indeed a woman, then there's no problem. But of course, this isn't a woman, this is a man. The nurse's duty of care, it says, extends to protect patients from harassment. So you must remind the objecting woman of this. Therefore, you're accusing her of harassment. And if that woman continues to object and be vocal in the ward, it may be her who is removed.
Yes.
So her care can be disrupted. Where is she going to go? We don't know. But there may be no other bed on that ward. She may have to go to a different ward.
And in fact, we know someone else who was effectively discharged, and they were incredibly unwell. But this exact situation, they all descended. The staff descended en masse. They basically made up a load of stuff in her notes retrospectively. She left the unit despite the fact she was incredibly unwell. They monitored her on Twitter as she spoke about her case. It was incredibly distressing, and it took her a long time.
It was terrible and so unprofessional, the way that was handled, and it was so clearly seized upon by ideologues. And I've heard of other cases like that, where women have had to protect themselves by pulling their own curtains because there's been a man exposing himself. And it puts those women at risk, as you say, because should they deteriorate, they're not observed. They're not protected either.
The other inhibition is a huge factor on wards anyway. I mean, it's just, it goes with the territory, doesn't it? But it's just something you as professionals you deal with, but patients should.
Yes. In addition, the Glasgow and Clyde policy compares the need for same-sex space to racism, as we've seen this elision before many times. If a white woman complained to a nurse about sharing a ward with a black patient, or a heterosexual male complained about being in a ward with a gay man, we would expect our staff to act in a manner that deals with the behaviour. This is on a completely fallacious basis, and it's written to shame women, to prevent them, to silence them, to prevent them speaking out about their needs and wishes, which has been done for decades. Women's health has not had the attention that it needed. And even now, mental health units are designed really with men in mind, where sex-based protections and needs are not being looked at. They're not being acknowledged now. They're being flattened. They're being swept away, really, in this drive to become universal gender, neutral, gender neutral.
Essentially, because there's no recourse, because of course, you can't argue this with trusts, because they're effectively saying that this is entirely lawful and what they should be doing. Essentially, this has to be a government-led initiative, and until Annex B is effectively withdrawn, it's a stymied position. I mean, I don't know if you think that is going to happen. We're actually going to be able to get rid of Annex B, or
Well, we were hopeful the end of last year, but it seems to have been returned to us with just this very small tweak, which has actually elevated the status of all people with gender identities to the top.
right.
So people who are not protected by the Equality Act, people who like to dress up in women's
Right.
clothing.
Yeah, yeah.
So Annex B now seems to be watertight. It seems to not only downgrade, it doesn't mention women at all. So it doesn't mention any conflict of rights or needs. It simply dictates to us that people with any gender identity must be given choice and must be given preferential treatment, really. But so
Yeah, there's a book. Good.
with
Good
that in
for
mind,
that, Sally.
with that in mind, I had a very useful conversation with trust management this week, and as I said, I'm not very political, and I don't know these people personally, but I seized an opportunity, and that opportunity came in looking at the post-mortem of the maternity scandal in East Kent, which was very like the one in Morecambe some years ago. And Bill Kirkup wrote a report about both of them. And my trust has been very proactive and is running engagement sessions to look at what went wrong, what were the themes that Kirkup drew out of it, what can we use to move forward and to avoid scandal coming to our door, because we really don't want that. We want the future to be better than the past. And I am very encouraged. I went to the second one of these on Tuesday, and it was a much smaller meeting. The CEO, the chief nurse, and the medical director, and operationals, someone who was working between staff and management, was running it. And so all the important people were there. And the conversation did go, as it often does, onto management of staff and how we can involve staff's opinions. But I got the conversation onto patient safeguarding. And I said that I had raised this issue last year, that we have a safeguarding policy which has a fundamental weakness, and I would like to work with you this year to resolve it. And I was very warmly received.
Oh, okay.
And the answer was yes immediately, and the CEO was nodding, and we have agreed to do an equality impact assessment on Annex B for our trust. And I'm encouraged that this is a positive way to go, because I know of another trust nearby who have done this successfully, and they've been able to revoke it to they don't use Annex B. They've written their own trans policy, which balances the rights of all those who have protected characteristics.
So do you think that, I take it this has gone back, parliamentarians who are acting on our behalf, they're not going to let this rest, I imagine, and they'll try and have another go at this. Is that correct?
I'm sure that, yeah, because the work has been going on for several years. I'm sure that it won't stop now. And of course, events in Scotland have shown us that nothing stays the same. And if there is too much of an overreach, there has to be a time when,
Yeah.
when it all crashes to the ground, because this problem in safeguarding has been built on a fiction,
Mm.
and it's become
Whole
very
GRA is a
tenacious.
fiction, isn't it?
It's become very, sorry.
Whole GRA is a fiction, isn't it? Everything about it's a fiction.
That's right. That's right. And in medicine, we cannot work with fiction. We can only work with reality and science and evidence. At any moment, could be very unsafe. And the other aspect of this is the law, is the Mental Capacity Act, which protects those who have lost the capacity to protect themselves in a decision-making capacity. So it doesn't cover those who've got a physical disability, but those who can't weigh up the pros and cons of deciding something, and they can't actually consent to treatment because they don't know what the problem is or what the treatments involve. So those patients are actually super protected in the health service, because it means that everybody around them, and that involves me, must take great care to make all decisions in that person's best interests, as you will well know, Isla. If any decision was made that impacted on that patient's best interests or their wishes, we are accountable to the Court of Protection, and the case could go to court. And I'm very pleased to know this, because this is a great safeguard for those people who have lost the most and who have the most to lose, who have the least control over their environment or their treatment. So it doesn't just mean that we can impose the treatment we know is best. And that is a good thing for them. If we know that they wanted to survive a stroke, for example, we do everything to help them survive, to promote a better outcome. But we also have to be led by their wishes. Even though they lack the capacity to consent, they don't lack wishes. And very often those wishes are to go home, or very often about that. And so even though there might be a slight risk involved in a course of action, we do still have to be guided by their wishes. And to make sure that those wishes are still upheld, they are appointed a best interest assessor who will come to talk to our staff about, well, what are you doing? I know about all these risks, but what are you doing to help this man go home where he needs to be and he wants to be? And that is a great, it's a set of brakes on the process whereby a person's freedom or a person's rights might be taken away. So I'm going to get back to women now, because I believe that I can prove that any woman lacking capacity to consent is super protected by the law. Because if that woman is in a 4-bedded bay, as she would be in my ward, she had the expectation of coming into same-sex accommodation, and we know that the risk of assault or of loss of dignity and privacy is augmented by maintaining that same-sex environment. Now, if we were to allow a man to be admitted into that environment, we have immediately raised the risk to her of sexual assault and loss of privacy and dignity. Now, the fact that she might not be able to speak or she might lack legal capacity doesn't mean that she is unaware that a man is suddenly sleeping next to her or might be exposing himself. And of course, the family as well will raise an objection about that. And so I believe then that we're breaking the law. We would be breaking the law if we allowed that non-capacitous woman to have risks of the environment raised against her, which means that the other women.
Yeah, unless we get cases, though, I think unless people actually, go through the lawfare process, I don't think that anything will change, because the trusts are so used to people, I mean, their legal departments are throwing money, so much cash at cases every day because they just don't really care. Having
Well,
been through the complaint process myself, they are, Teflon, these trusts.
yes, I think just now it is an opportunity where there is this very acute awareness that things have gone wrong, and this sensitivity. So next week, I'm meeting with the adult safeguarding lead and a member of our trust who is very much involved in people who've lost mental capacity. And her title is Liberty Protection Specialist. She's a social worker by training. With them, I'm going to be exploring this area of law and to find out to know what would be the consequences of us as staff to change the same-sex environment around someone who is non-capacitous. And I believe that we will be able to prove that we would be breaking the law, and that should be an immediate stop on any trust allowing a policy which allows us to mix sex and pretend that it's same sex.
Mm. I want this to happen. You need to make this happen for me, and you need to come back and tell me that.
I found a very friendly KC who is very much involved in this area of law as well.
Right. Wow.
And he emailed me back and said this is a most interesting and most difficult area. And he wasn't allowed to give me any legal advice, of course, but should we get to that stage, he is the man that I think might prove our case.
Well, look, Sally, I could talk to you all day about all these different things, but thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise and your knowledge. This is brilliant.
Thank you, Ida.
And we'll really, I think people find it really helpful and to find out a bit more about their rights and difficulties. So, yeah.
That's right. We need to keep speaking up for our rights and keep speaking for ourselves and for those who've lost capacity and who aren't able to express their wishes. And that's really what it's all about, isn't it?
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Isla. Lovely to speak to you. Bye-bye.
Bye.